The gun trembled in her hand, dust swirling between 'em like ghosts of what they'd lost. His eyes, those same eyes that once promised her forever, now stared back cold as a winter grave. Blood seeped through his shirt where her bullet had grazed his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He just stood there in the fading desert light, waiting for her to finish what she'd started. Her voice cracked like dry timber. She told him she'd buried his name 6 years ago, carved it into a cross and left it to rot in the Oklahoma wind. She'd mourned him, wept over an empty coffin, built a new life from the ashes of his memory. And now here he stood, alive and breathing, with that same crooked smile that had fooled her once before. He didn't deny it, didn't beg. He just asked her one question. Did she remember the promise they'd made under the cottonwood tree the night before everything went wrong? Her finger tightened on the trigger. Then she lowered the gun, and the silence that followed was louder than any gunshot could ever be. Because in that moment, she realized the man she'd loved had died 6 years ago after all. This stranger wearing his face was just a shadow of broken choices and buried regrets. Now let me ask you something, friend. If the person you'd grieved for, the one whose ghost you'd carried in your heart like a stone, suddenly walked back into your life with blood on their hands and lies on their lips, what would you do? Would you pull that trigger and end the story once and for all? Or would you lower the gun and ask the one question you'd been too afraid to whisper in the dark all those lonely years? Why? Her name was Elena Cortez, and she'd met James Holloway when she was barely 19, working her father's trading post on the edge of the New Mexico territory. James rode in one autumn morning with a wounded horse and a story about outlaws chasing him through the mountains. She stitched up his mare, and he stitched together her lonely heart with promises that tasted sweeter than honey wine. He stayed through winter, helped her father with the heavy work, charmed her mother with stories of the frontier, and whispered plans of a future in Elena's ear when the stars came out. They'd build a ranch together, he said, raise horses, fill a home with laughter and children. Under that old cottonwood tree, with her hand in his, he swore on his life that nothing would ever tear them apart. They married in spring, and for 6 months, Elena lived inside a dream. But dreams on the frontier have a way of crumbling when the sun gets too hot and the truth starts seeping through the cracks. The first sign came when a stranger arrived, asking for James by a different name. James brushed it off, said it was a case of mistaken identity, but Elena saw the fear flash across his face before he hid it behind that easy grin. The second sign came when she found a saddlebag tucked under their bed, filled with more money than a drifter should ever carry. When she asked him about it, he kissed her forehead and told her not to worry her pretty head about men's business. But Elena was her father's daughter, raised to read the desert wind and know when a storm was brewing. She started watching James closer, noticed how he'd disappear for days with no explanation, how he'd flinch when riders approached, how he'd count that money late at night when he thought she was sleeping, his fingers trembling like a man running from something that refused to let him go. Then came the night everything shattered. A marshal rode up to their door with a warrant and a cold smile. Said James Holloway was wanted for robbery in 3 territories. Said he'd been riding with the Ketchum gang, stealing payroll and leaving bodies in his wake. Said there was a price on his head that would make any man rich. James ran. Didn't even look back at Elena standing in the doorway, her world collapsing like a house built on sand. The marshal's men chased him into the canyon, and when the gunshots echoed back through the dark, Elena fell to her knees and waited for her heart to stop breaking. But hearts don't stop just because you want them to. They keep beating, keep hurting, keep remembering every lie that tasted like love. 3 days later, the marshal brought James's hat, torn and blood-stained, told her they'd found his body at the bottom of the ravine, too mangled to bring back. Told her she was a widow before she'd even learned to be a wife. Elena buried his name, not his body. There was nothing left to bury, but his memory, his promises, every whispered word that had turned poison in her mouth. She sold everything, left New Mexico and disappeared into the Arizona territory, where nobody knew her story and nobody asked questions. She became someone new, someone harder, someone who'd never be fooled by a charming smile and empty promises again. She worked as a cook in a mining camp, saved every penny, and eventually bought a small piece of land where she raised horses just like James had promised they would. But she did it alone, built every fence with her own hands, broke every stallion with her own will, and at night, when the desert wind howled through the canyon, she told herself she was free. 6 years passed like dust in the wind. 6 years of teaching herself not to remember, not to wonder if things could have been different, not to dream about cottonwood trees and promises made under stars that had long since burned out. Then, one scorching July afternoon, a stranger rode into her small ranch asking for water. She handed him a canteen without looking up, her mind on the mare that was due to foal any day. But when she finally raised her eyes and saw his face, the earth stopped spinning. James Holloway, older, scarred, with a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, but alive, breathing, real. He recognized her the same instant, and whatever lie he'd been about to tell died on his lips. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, 6 years of grief and rage crackling in the space between them like lightning before a storm. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She walked into her house, came back with her father's old revolver, and told him to start talking or start praying. And James, the man who'd always had an answer for everything, finally told her the truth. He'd been riding with the Ketchum gang, but not by choice. They'd threatened his family back east, forced him into jobs he never wanted, hold his past over his head like a noose waiting to drop. When he met Elena, he thought he could escape, thought love might be strong enough to outrun his demons. But the gang found him, gave him one last job, and when the marshal came, James knew he had 2 choices: run and maybe live, or stay and definitely die. So he ran. Let him think he died in that canyon while he crawled away bleeding and broken. Spent 6 years moving from town to town, working under false names, always looking over his shoulder. And every single night he thought about the woman he'd left standing in that doorway, wondering if she'd ever forgive him for choosing his own life over hers. Elena listened to every word, the gun never wavering in her hand. And when he finished, when his voice finally broke and he told her he'd come back because he couldn't die without knowing if there was any piece of her that still remembered what they'd had, she asked him the only question that mattered. Did he really think love could survive on lies? That's when Elena pulled the trigger, not to kill him, but to wake him up. The bullet tore through his shoulder, enough to hurt, but not enough to end him. She wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain he'd left her with, wanted him to bleed the way she'd bled for 6 long years. But as he stood there, blood seeping between his fingers, not fighting back, not making excuses, just accepting her rage like penance, she saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine regret. The kind that carves lines in a man's face and steals the light from his eyes. He wasn't the charming drifter anymore. He was just a broken man who'd made terrible choices and spent 6 years living with the weight of them. Elena lowered the gun, not because she forgave him, not because the pain had suddenly vanished or the years of grief had been erased, She lowered it because she finally understood something the desert had been trying to teach her all along. Some things can't be fixed, can't be taken back, can't be rewritten no matter how much we wish they could. She told James to get back on his horse and ride, told him she'd buried his name 6 years ago, and as far as she was concerned, that grave was still full. Whatever man he'd become in the years since, that was between him and his own conscience, but he'd never be her husband again. Never be the man who'd promised her forever under a cottonwood tree that probably didn't even exist anymore. James nodded, pressed his hand against the wound, climbed onto his horse with the weight of 6 years heavy on his shoulders. Before he rode off into the desert he'd crawled out of, he said one last thing. Said he was sorry. Said he'd spend the rest of his life wishing he'd been brave enough to stay. Said if she ever needed anything, she could leave word in Santa Fe and he'd come running. Elena didn't respond. She just watched him disappear into the heat shimmer, becoming a ghost again, the way he should have stayed all along. That night she didn't cry. She went to her barn, helped her mare through a difficult birth, and welcomed a strong foal into the world as the stars came out overhead. And somewhere between the pain of labor and the miracle of new life, Elena realized something profound. She'd spent 6 years building a life from the ruins of broken promises, and nothing, not even a dead man walking back into her world, could take that away from her. The lesson the desert taught her was simple, but hard as iron. Love built on lies will always crumble, no matter how sweet the foundation tastes. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to forgive the person who hurt you, is to forgive yourself for believing in something that was never real to begin with. Elena never saw James Holloway again, but she never forgot him either. His ghost became part of her story, a reminder that the heart can break and still keep beating. The trust once shattered can teach us to build something stronger in its place. If this tale touched your heart, then don't ride off just yet. There are more stories waiting beneath the western sign. Tales of love, betrayal, and lessons learned the hard way. Subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, where every story reminds us that love still rides, even across the roughest frontier. Because out here, where the desert meets the sky, and the past has a way of finding you no matter how far you run, the truth always catches up. And sometimes that truth is the only thing that can set you free.